The NCAA tournament catches casual fans, in my opinion, probably better than a lot of other sporting events because of the fact that there's bracket challenges and people just like to watch the haves versus the have-nots, or the perceived haves versus the have-nots. And I think when we went, we did meet up with a lot of people who were just there. Either they had been there before and they were back meeting with friends and they didn't have a dog in the fight. And that was kind of refreshing to know that we weren't the only people who were just there to be there. So I think that the experience, even though the games could have been better, we did see some good basketball played by at least one team on the floor. We saw a few moments of what really makes the NCAA tournament a lot of fun, when these fan bases go on a little bit of an emotional high, or when there's a perceived comeback happening. But for the most part, it was all chalk. And that's kind of been the story of the tournament, in my opinion. And I will say this for the two of us, though, it did lend, I'm talking about our game experience, to a lot of good conversations that we're probably going to resurface here about the tournament, about selection, and there's a lot of other stuff to cover. So I think we're going to be totally fine, even though those games could have been better. It just means that next year, all buzzer beaters.
Right, and we joked it up, Pittsburgh was the place that we should have gone, right? Because they had Oakland there, they had the overtime game with NC State, and then was it double overtime between Oregon and Creighton? So, no, our luck though, if we would have gone to Pittsburgh, Wagner would have beat North Carolina, and Charlotte is how it would have worked out. But, no, you're right, it did create a lot of good conversations about different things, types of things that fans talk about, when it comes to selection and stuff like that. And then, I think we talked about on Selection Sunday when we did the watch party about how there were a lot of bid stealers, or there were going to be a lot of bid stealers. And I think that did sort of, dare I say, dilute the quality of some of these potential, Cinderella teams you get, these 15 and 16 seeds, that you'd like to see get in there, and maybe give one of these power teams a run for their money. And a lot of those conferences, the best team in the league didn't win the tournament, and so we were left with a lesser opponent, I guess, in some cases, which took away from the potential for these Cinderella teams. And right now, I think NC State is the lowest seeded team currently in the Sweet 16. I think they're at 10 or an 11.
They're an 11. I think they're the only one that is seated under 5 in the entire Sweet 16, which
I think
in
Clemson might be 6.
yeah, they're
They're
6.
yeah.
In recent history, though, that's been uncommon to see that much chalk. Now, a lot of times, and we discussed this, you'll see chalk when you get to the Final Four. You'll see a little bit more of it the deeper that you get. But normally in the Sweet 16, you will see a couple of good stories, at least in recent history. And that's exactly what you're talking about, and what you alluded to is the fact that I think because there was a lot of bid stealing, the madness of March actually took place leading up to the NCAA tournament. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. This is how the tournament is decided, how the tournament field is decided, is by these conference tournaments, by these resumes with at-large bids and all that. And there is an opportunity for teams to get hot, like NC State, win 3 in a row, 4 in a row, 5 in a row, and get to the tournament. That's the whole point of the conference tournaments outside of making money. But when we looked at St. Peter's, who a couple years ago made a run, that was not the same St. Peter's team whatsoever. That was a bid stealer. Wagner had 7 active players, so there's no way that they're going to be able to make any noise against a North Carolina who is clearly very good after what we saw. And then a lot of the other bid stealers, a couple of them got some wins, but even the mid-majors that should have been better didn't get some of those wins we were hoping for. McNeese looked absolutely horrific, but maybe that's not them. Maybe it's the fact that Gonzaga is peaking, because Gonzaga then took out Kansas like as if they weren't even there, and Kansas couldn't miss a bucket in the first half, and I notoriously said that, didn't make a bucket the rest of the game. So it's just March, and I think that that's kind of where we are, is that there's no predictability to it, and we just have to roll with it. Some years it's going to be like this. Some years it's going to be like a couple years ago where we had an 8-9 matchup in the national championship. That's kind of what makes it fun.
Oh, it absolutely is. And what we have right now left in the Sweet 16 are the highly talented teams. The number one seeds have performed very well up to this point. Haven't really been challenged much, and so you have the big time teams with a lot of talent performing well, and you have a combination of that and the teams that got hot at the right time, like the NC States, and even, Oregon didn't make it to the Sweet 16, but they were in a double overtime game with Creighton, and they went on a run to win the Pac-12 and get themselves into the tournament, and they wouldn't have been otherwise, right? So it, that I think is what you sort of would expect. If it weren't for all the upsets we've had the last couple of years, I think in most cases you come into the tournament expecting, hey, like we're going to see, obviously when it starts to whittle down, we're going to see the best teams and we're going to see the hottest teams. And that makes perfect sense, right? But we've been really, maybe our perception's been messed with a little bit the last few years by some of these runs these lower seeds have gone on.
Oh, totally. I mean, we now expect it. And
Yeah.
before that, it wasn't anything that was a guarantee. I mean, a 16 had never beaten a number one. And now in the last, 6 years, we've seen two of them happen. And I think we now come to expect these 15s and 16s. And not to say that they're not good basketball teams, but I think that it has to be the perfect storm for one of these teams to even win one game, let alone go on a run to the Elite Eight. And that's why it doesn't happen very often. That's why a 15 will get one win, and that'll be considered a success for them. But it is what it is. I just want to talk about one upset because there was one upset that got a lot of people talking. And it got a lot of people talking because obviously Oakland was a fascinating story with that guy, Jack Golke, who just throws up threes. But on the other side of that is John Calipari. And we talked about coaches that seem to falter in the biggest moments. And John Calipari, I don't think is one of them. But when you coach at Kentucky, and now in the last few years, I think even since the pandemic, he has had very little success in the tournament. This is a guy who I think is entering his 16th year at Kentucky. Somebody can correct me if I'm wrong. And he's won national titles. He's been very, very successful. But the spotlight is on him now after this, and he's had a lot of excuses, I'll put it that way, about the age of his players versus the age of these mid-majors and stuff. But ultimately, you're Kentucky, and you should be having the best players, and you should be winning these basketball games. So I wanted to ask you if you think that it's fair, the criticism that he is getting, if you should look at the whole resume, and is John Calipari maybe in or getting to that Nick Saban territory where the new age of college basketball is going to engulf him and pass him by, and he should get out while the getting's good?
I think the criticism he's getting is fair because just making the tournament has never been the standard at Kentucky, right? Um, National championships are the expectation, and him being knocked out of the tournament early the last couple seasons certainly doesn't reflect well on him, and especially the teams that he's lost to. And not taking away from those teams, but those are teams that Kentucky is supposed to beat, plain and simple. And there's truth to what he says. I mean, sure, it is excuse making, I suppose, but yeah, I mean, he's going out there with a roster. He had a lot of success with these one and done type players, these rosters with 18, 19-year-old kids that were highly talented, and it would take them maybe half of a season or so to really get them to play together, and then they'd go on their run, right? And now I think with NIL and the transfer portal, but maybe more so NIL, you have kids willing to stay in school a little longer at some of these other places because they're making money and maybe try to improve their uh, their professional profile and prospects before they leave college because you'd have guys that would leave right away as soon as there was any semblance of them being able to make some good money because how can you pass that up? Well, now these guys are getting the money, maybe not at the same level in some cases or in most cases, but they're getting paid pretty good to play the college game, and so they're going to stay and play it longer. And then, of course, the story with a lot of mid majors has always been the togetherness and the chemistry that they have because most of those guys have played together for 3 or 4 years. But even now with the transfer portal, like that's not always the case because the best guys get poached away, and you have to basically reinvent your roster every season. But at the same time, you have guys that come from higher level teams and come down to a mid major maybe that are really talented too. So it's really an interesting dynamic. And as far as should he get out while the getting's good, kind of Nick Saban style, I don't know if I subscribe to that so much because I feel like Cal's one of those guys that's always sort of operated in the gray area a little bit, before NIL was a thing.
What are you
It
talking
was,
about?
I think, yeah, I mean, you know exactly what I'm talking about. I mean, I think that Cal's always been one of those guys that has maybe had that reputation of sort of doing whatever it takes to get the guys he needs. Um, and maybe now it's harder for him to do that with, maybe NIL levels the playing field, to some degree. I mean, I know everybody's always paid players, but now with it being much easier to do so, maybe he's lost a little bit of an edge that he had.
I kind of wonder if maybe he's lost an edge in his coaching because I don't think talent's the problem for Kentucky. If you look at the class that they brought in this past year, I think three of the guys they brought in were in the top 25 or something like that. So talent really isn't an issue. The transfer portal shouldn't be much of an issue because you would think that there are people who want to play at Kentucky. And I think that Kentucky is still a desirable destination for a college basketball player, no?
Yeah, I would I mean, it is. It's a blue blood, right? And when you talk about if you were to ask someone who doesn't really pay attention, like, "Hey, name me a school that is, really good at college basketball," I think if they were to rattle off 3 or 4, Kentucky is gonna be one of them.
Absolutely, but it also highlights the fact that the culture of winning. I mean, Kentucky is not a job in which you can have any type of rebuilding. And I will say this though, I mean, a lot of programs would take what John Calipari has done as success, and there's a lot of them that would, but Kentucky is just a different beast entirely. But let me ask you this. There's been a ton of coaching moves, obviously. A lot of these mid-major coaches moving up, and even guys like from Washington State moving up to what they perceive as better jobs. And if the Kentucky job were open, would that be similar to the Alabama job where it would be like everybody would want that job?
I think so, just because it is. I mean, you're stepping up into one of the biggest programs in the country, especially in the world of, basketball, and, it's gonna pay well, of course. At the same time, though, it obviously just not unlike Alabama football, it comes with a lot of other things on the periphery that you have to deal with and people you have to appease, and maybe that sort of thing isn't for everyone, but I think that if the paycheck's large enough, they could probably get on board with whatever they needed to do. Um, so, yeah, it's right up there in that conversation with, the Dukes, the Carolinas, the Alabama football. Um, it's in that same conversation for sure.
Do you think that the allure for these coaches, and I'm thinking of specifically, like, let's take Darren DeVries, for example, and we've talked about him on Braves Talk, now former Drake coach going to West Virginia. Obviously, the pay bump is a big part of it because who doesn't want to get paid more to do the same job? But I have to think that the allure of extra resources has to be a factor where it's like, look at what I did here. Imagine what I could do with more. And I know a lot of people don't like today's NIL transfer portal stuff because it does take away that loyalty. A lot of guys aren't as willing sometimes to get through adversity with a team. And there's a lot of pros and cons to it. But for coaches specifically, I can understand why you're a guy like DeVries or maybe a Josh Schertz who's like, wow, I've been really successful here. I love it here, but I'm not only going to get paid more, but boy, they're going to throw a bunch of resources at me. And maybe if I can continue to recruit the way that I have and work the transfer portal, now we can make bigger, stronger, faster teams and stuff like that. It doesn't always work out that way, but the allure of that has to be appealing.
Oh, for sure. I mean, now let's not forget, I mean, it's all relative, right?
Sure.
So, obviously you're coming from the Missouri Valley where the resources are not the same as they are in the Big 12. And, but you're at least on the same level as your peers. And now you're taking a step up. And yes, you're going to have exponentially more resources, but so is, you're going to be around the same level as everyone else in the league, relatively speaking. So I think that, that's where it is maybe a more of a coaching thing, right? And let's see, like Josh Schertz dominated Division II basketball for over a decade before he ended up in Indiana State, and we see what he's done there. Obviously, I mean, so there's no question the guy can coach. It's just a matter of him having to go through the steps of getting to that top job. And from everything I've sort of gathered, uh, it sounds like it was kind of a Louisville botch job, that really kinda led to him not ending up there, when
No,
it was
come
all said and
on.
done,
What are
and
you
so
talking about?
and there's a lot more to that story, I think, but, um, you're right, though, these guys wanna see what they can do when they have the ability to go out there and recruit the best players that they can get and, see what they can do with that talent.
Yeah, and right now is transfer portal time, which is interesting. Like I don't know who came up with the idea for the transfer portal to open. Wasn't it like on Selection Sunday or sometime around then? And it seems like it's conflicting where you have schools that are participating in the NCAA tournament, and then they've got to basically recruit their own players or some postseason tournament. But I know, again, there's a lot of vitriol sometimes about the transfer portal because we as fans love our teams. We love to think about or fantasize about players staying. But for the longest time, players weren't able to move if the situation wasn't right for them. And now, of course, it's opened up the door for players to just leave at any time because they want to go get that bag. And it's not a perfect system. I think that hopefully it's headed toward being a little bit more regulated, but I don't blame the players necessarily for wanting to get something more because they see these coaches doing it at the drop of a hat. And loyalty to the school is one thing, but like these coaches are supposedly supposed to be loyal to their players, and so few of them actually stick around to be loyal to them. Where it's like, again, I don't fault a coach for taking a better job. Josh Schertz could work his entire life at Indiana State, make more money than me for sure. But when there are jobs that want him that he could make more money at and be more successful and obtain what you always say, that generational wealth in some form or fashion, I can't necessarily fault the players for wanting a little bit of that when historically they have been unable to do so without losing a year of eligibility.
I agree, and I mean, at some point, this stuff's gonna get figured out and sort of, uh leveled out to some degree. Some sort of parameters are going to be put around this at some point in time. And I think what happened is they went from being like, okay, these guys are, these schools are making money hand over fist um, off of these players, and it's not right. They should be able to, off their, it's ridiculous that X school can make however many dollars off selling so and so's jersey. Like that player should get a piece of that sort of thing. And they've kind of taken it and they've overcorrected in a way by just making it wide open, and it'll eventually correct itself. I have a feeling, and because I just don't know what it. I mean, I just trying to think of what is like college football and college basketball going to look like in 10 years if it keeps going exactly as it is and nothing changes.
It's going to look like a
Um,
pro league.
it's gonna be wild, and, at least I feel like it's gonna be insane because it's just an arms race at that point. It's who's got the most money, and, we've talked about it with other sports and in other situations where these boosters, they wanna win. They wanna win badly, and winning is so profitable to these schools that they're gonna make sure it happens too, and they're gonna put whatever resources they have into it, and so as that those numbers, that money gets just creeps higher and higher and higher, it's going to be ridiculous. And it makes you wonder if, well, at what point in time does the money get so great that it does start to impact maybe some of these pro salaries, even like, hey, like if you want me to come to the NFL, like you're going to have to up the ante a little bit because I'm getting paid, you know, 5 million at, Duke or which is that's not realistic, but I'm saying it could get to there at some point. Who knows? And yeah, I think I was telling my dad this, we were talking about, I think that things would be a lot smoother if we had one or the other. Just had the transfer portal where players could move freely, but you didn't have NIL where they could be enticed to move because of money. Or you had just NIL, but not the portal, to where you essentially only have to recruit that kid once, and he doesn't have the freedom to just walk out the door anytime that he wants to. I mean, if you kept the old rules where they have to sit out a year and that sort of thing, maybe, but um, I get it. It's hard to, as fans, we want to find a way to solve for it because it makes it hard to, um, as fans, we all develop that relationship. We never meet a lot of these players in most cases, but we develop that relationship. We feel like we know them, right? Uh, we're invested in them, and it stinks when the roster turns over. 50 to 60% of the roster turns over year after year, and it makes it harder to do that as a fan, harder to kind of invest in these players and watch them over the entirety of their careers. And so, um, it, so as fans, we want to fix it, right? But at the same time, like from just a pure like objective perspective, like I can't find a good reason why these guys shouldn't be allowed to uh, capitalize financially on what they're doing and what they're doing for these universities. And, the freedom to transfer, that's a little different story, I guess. There probably should be some sort of limitations on that, I think.
Yeah,
But
I think you're right. The
uh,
limitations is the hardest part because I think it stinks or did stink when you would transfer because not every transfer is created equal. Sometimes the transfer is because that player knows he's not going to get any playing time. And a lot of these kids are going to go pro in something that's not basketball. So they want to be able to find a situation where they can play and maybe open up some avenues for them in something other than football. I don't know. I mean, so having to sit out an entire year would take away a lot. It was I think the players were losing more in that equation when coaches don't have to do that. They can just swiftly go off and start recruiting for this new school. It's like what I said about Buzz Williams, how Buzz Williams was a Hokie until he wasn't. And then all of a sudden he was all about the Aggies, right? And it's like, man, it's cold, but it's kind of how it works. So